If I haven't met you yet, I want to introduce myself. My name is Jordan Decker, and I'm your statewide Local Government Energy Efficiency Best Practices Coordinator. A bit of a mouthful, but that's my title per the CPUC decision that created my position. My role is really to serve as your coordinator on energy efficiency and sustainability issues as you work through your own goals in local government. So if you haven't connected with me yet, I encourage you to do so. I think that there are hundreds of you out there that are on my weekly updates list that I send out. So if you're not on that yet, please get in touch with me. I'd love to connect with you. I'm really excited about this session. I want to welcome you, first of all, to this plenary session, which is the State of Local Climate Action in California. I come as a recent transplant to California from the city of New York. And I just want to say, having worked in local government, in a large local government, where we dealt with a lot of data, we relied on huge amounts of data from our utility and best practices from other local governments to build out our policies there, and benchmarking, audits, retrofits data. We were very deep in data, but I've never tried to work with the data across and track the progress across the 58 counties and 482 cities of the state. So it really is a feat, and I really am really excited to talk to this panel today about where we are, what we do to get that high-level look and try to inform our policies using that look. So I do want to jump right into it and welcome our panelists to the stage. We have Bryan Holland. Bryan oversees ICLEI's programs supporting local governments in climate mitigation and adaptation. That's ICLEI Local Governments for Sustainability, one of the NGO partners of the SEEK Collaborative. His team delivers software tools, training, technical assistance, and research throughout California and nationwide. We also have Michael McCormick. Michael McCormick is a senior planner at the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research, OPR, which serves the governor and his cabinet as staff for long-range planning and research and constitutes the comprehensive state planning agency. His work at OPR, along with recent work at NOAA and the White House Council on Environmental Quality, is focused at the nexus of high-level climate and sustainability goals and local implementation. Michael's focus is on institutional transformation by leading the development of partnerships, tools, resources, guidance, and programs that support strong action on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and increasing community resilience to the impacts of a changing climate. And in the middle here we have Steve Sanders, another of my partners on the SEEK Collaborative. Steve Sanders directs the Land Use and Environment Program at the Institute for Local Government, ILG. ILG provides resources to help local officials develop their communities in ways that meet their social, economic, and environmental goals. And the Institute is the research and education arm of the League of California Cities and the California State Association of Counties. So, we're here to talk about the state of local climate action in California. We've got a lot of local actors in the audience. And as we've already had a chance to discuss a little bit today, depending on what sessions everyone was in the morning, we have very ambitious state and local goals driving local government energy action. The governor's executive order issued last April set the most ambitious, or some of the most ambitious greenhouse gas reduction targets in North America. 40% below the 1990 levels by 2030 and 80 by 2050, as I think we're all aware. And tracking progress is really key if we want to get there. So each of you operate in different roles, right? So we're talking about the state level to the statewide perspective, but really more focused on the local government level. Given these different roles and approaches, perhaps you could start off by sharing what specifically each of you are doing to touch in and touch base with the state of local climate action. Bryan? Yeah, sure.
Okay. Can you all hear me okay? Is the mic on? Yeah, great. So hey everyone, I'm Bryan Holland with ICLEI, and I guess just starting at the beginning, ICLEI is a nonprofit organization. We're a network of over 1,000 cities worldwide that are leading on climate action, sustainability, resilience. And ICLEI USA is really headquartered here in California. We're one of the SEEK partners, and we've got a long history of basically working with local governments, trying to build capacity to be reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a really nice, natural fit to be able to partner with the state and with the other nonprofits that are part of SEEK. A big part of what we do, you talked about data and being able to sort of monitor progress. a big part of what we do is try to equip local governments to do that themselves through a process of emissions management, really providing a framework for sort of quantifying emissions, setting targets, mapping out plans that reduce them in a quantifiable way, and then monitoring those trends over time. And so we've created standards for generating that emissions data that now, really are achieving penetration levels in California that we're finally starting to see really standardized approaches across local governments, consistency across the state, consistency over time, and really starting to realize that vision of being able to compare apples to apples in terms of emissions trends over time. So I think those protocols is a big part of what we've brought to the table in terms of monitoring. And then we also have software tools that help local governments to implement those protocols. So protocols contains all kind of different methods and reporting requirements. We've sort of realized those in a software tool called ClearPath. Many of you are familiar with. It's a SEEK resource. It's available to all local governments in California. And folks and local governments are using ClearPath to actually calculate their emissions inventories, calculate their forecasts, estimate emissions reductions from different policies, and monitor their trends over time. So we're really starting to, with hundreds of users statewide, starting to really get an interesting set of data directly from the local governments about their emissions levels, their trends, what's working, what's not. And so a lot to start to take apart using some of that data.
Great.
So that's kind of where we fit in the space.
Great. Steve, over to you.
Sure. So the Institute for Local Government, and as Jordan mentioned, we are the research and education arm of the League of California Cities, so that's all 482 cities that she talked about. Also the California State Association of Counties, so that's all 58 counties, as well as most recently in the last year, the California Special Districts Association, so that's 2,000 special districts around the state. And we have this kind of unique and really interesting place that we occupy, which is we're not so much involved on the policy development side in terms of the advocacy in the legislature and with the governor's office and all that. That's really what our parent organizations do. So the League, CSAC, and CSDA all have lobbyists, they all have advocacy groups, they all do legislative alerts and that sort of stuff, and are involved in the day-to-day sort of debate and discussion around what policies should be put in place. And we have a different kind of a role, which is there are sort of ongoing responsibilities and new areas that local officials need to be equipped to deal with. And so what ILG is, as the 501c3 arm of those statewide associations, is really the resource to help city and county and special district officials carry out their responsibilities. And we do that in a broad array of areas. We have a very robust ethics program and do much of the ethics training for public officials around the state. We have a very active public engagement and civic engagement program that helps local officials understand how to get their community participating in activities and how to get new arrivals incorporated and inclusive, and to deal with the civic traditions that might be from other places and how to integrate them into what it means to be a resident in California. We have work where we do intergovernmental collaboration, so cities and counties and schools that partner with each other. And we also have a sustainability program, and that looks at land use, which is an ongoing long-term responsibility, particularly cities and counties that have general authority over land use. And it also includes health in the built environment, an issue where that relationship between how we build things and run our cities and communities and what that means for people's health, and a very active climate program. And so our participation in the SEEK collaborative really revolves around that work we're doing on climate. And that came about because of the active interest on the part, particularly of the League of Cities and CSAC, in the debate over AB 32 and then the debate over SB 375. So 2006, 2008, a lot of heavy work, heavy lifting in crafting that legislation, and local governments were intimately involved in articulating what they did and didn't want to see in that legislation. But in both instances, you had a situation where local governments were constructively engaged with the state in setting broad new directions on climate, broad new directions on regional transportation planning to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And once that work is done, then the lobbyists move on and they're dealing with the demise of redevelopment or marijuana regulation or whatever. Somebody's got to be there to help those local officials then now deal with their new responsibilities. And so that really is what falls on ILG. And our approach in this field is to not supersede or contradict what the state's trying to do, but to complement it. And when the scoping plan was done in 2009, there was a recognition that you couldn't regulate your way to the greenhouse gas emission reductions. We couldn't simply rely on regulation to get there, and that there had to be a place for voluntary action. And that was voluntary action on the part of the private sector, voluntary action on the part of individuals, and voluntary action on the part of local governments. And so that's where we fit in. There's a 15% reduction goal in the scoping plan for local cities and counties to reduce their emissions. And the way we went about doing that was to say, let's create a program, the Beacon program, that enlists the innovation at the local level and gets cities and counties working together in a common framework and sharing their best practices and moving forward and measuring the results that they're achieving. And so that's the approach that we've been taking. We have 85 cities and counties currently enrolled in the program. We expect this week to get up to 86, maybe 87 in another couple weeks. So it's a growing program because there's a growing interest in this. And we can talk more as we have these questions, but I think what it illustrates is that even though there's tension, and it's undeniable in the relationship between state and local government, and you see that manifested in many realms, there's a common commitment to the future of the state and the future of its residents. And there's a recognition on the part of local governments that this is a field where local action is not only necessary, but it's vital. And I will even say, ICLEI has been around since long before AB 32. Actions that cities and counties were taking in California predate AB 32 as well. So in many cases, local government is leading the way. State government is now setting direction and providing resources and setting big targets, but it is a partnership moving forward, and how we keep that innovation and how we keep that sense of progress and continue building and accelerating it is going to be a test of how well the cities, counties, and the state can continue working together. And I think in this field particularly, it's actually been a very constructive and engaged process that's been underway.
That's a great segue to Michael's introduction on the state level.
And my comments can be a little shorter because I think Steve took a couple of my talking points and needing to work together.
I saw your notes, I just thought I'd steal them.
So OPR sits in a really interesting place. We're officially an office of the governor, and we have this unique relationship with local governments where we're designated as the local government liaison for the state. And we're really the main entity in the state that deals with land use. So we wind up having a lot of interagency conversations at the state level and trying to navigate the language state agencies and organizations are using and translating that for regional and local application. And in the context of climate change, that is a real challenge. And as mentioned in my bio, I was in DC for a year and a half ago, and the terminology and narrative there is completely different than how we talk about things here, although they are largely reliant upon California and New York to really help set the path on how the rest of the country is going to go in 5 or 10 years. So I'm excited to be up here with Jordan, who helped lead many of the initiatives in New York City. I think Steve really said it right. With all of our large and significant goals, and particularly our 2050 goal, we as a state have recognized during the first scoping plan process that the state can't do this alone. It's not possible. And you guys have probably heard this talking point before, but we all need to come together and work on this stuff together. It's an all hands on deck kind of issue. And so OPR, in our unique location within the state, we have the ability to help navigate some of the interagency challenges and creating commonality and creating a narrative that works for the local and regional scale. The executive order B3015 creates a great opportunity to really incorporate climate change into all infrastructure and investments coming through the state. It's one of the things we're working on right now through a technical advisory group working to implement the executive order. So later this year, early next year, there will be some strong guidance coming out for our state agencies on how to do that, and to recognize that a lot of the funds that the state manage are passed through to regional and local entities, and that there will now be a requirement that climate change is addressed as a contingency for receiving those funds. That's a really significant shift in how the state allocates funds. It's also a really significant shift in how we think about policies and programs. Brian and I have been working together for a decade, and Steve, I think we've probably been working together for a decade too, one way or another. And back when greenhouse gas emissions were being done in 2005, 6, and 7, we had the local government operations protocol, and people were like, oh, municipal inventory is no big deal. There's this LGOP thing out there that was created, and it's really helping us, but how the heck do we do this community inventory piece? And 2012, 2013, when the community protocol really started to be rolled out and ramped up, that's yesterday. That's just a couple years ago, but in our minds, the community protocol has been out there for a while because it really transformed the standardization process across local governments and how we think about doing community-wide emissions inventories. And it certainly makes the CEQA discussion easier because there's a standardized resource we can point to in CEQA and general plans to say, hey, there's this resource out there. It doesn't fit, it doesn't check all the boxes. Obviously because of the funds that were used to develop the resource. There's some augmentation needed in some areas like transportation and agricultural and forested lands. But for the most part, it checks all the boxes across the board. So we as an office have been working with ICLEI and ILG and LGC to really figure out how do we roll up the resources needed to support local initiatives to address greenhouse gas emissions, knowing the state can only take it so far. And so that's one of the big things my office does is really work with our NGO partners, work with our local and regional partners, work with the state agencies like the Air Resources Board and the Natural Resources Agency and the Office of Emergency Services and CAL FIRE and go on down the list to identify the resources that are needed to do a good analysis at the local level and try to make it really easy. And many of you know this, but there's really 3 ways we address dealing with greenhouse gas emissions. And we were talking about this at the table at lunch, right? There's making it really easy. So how do you do it so it's easy? Then how do you provide incentives to do this work, which SEEK is a good chunk of both of those, right? SEEK makes it easy, but it also provides resources to do this work. And the third piece of it is regulations, which pretty much nobody wants to go that route, particularly at the local level. So making it easy and providing the incentives to do the right thing is really where our office, and if you heard Randall talk this morning from SGC, I mean, it's really where SGC and OPR come together. OPR provides a lot of the guidance and the resources and the consistency across the board, working with our NGO partners. And then SGC works with us on that, but also on the funding side too, to really strategically think about where are the push points that can accelerate adoption of emissions reduction measures and programs and policies. So I think I'll leave it there because I could probably talk about this for a couple hours. But.
Great. So I know that each of you have some exciting details to share on the state of local climate action, but before we jump into the what, I'd really like to look at the how just briefly. Many of you know that I really like data. And just to our executive director, Kate Meese's point this morning, the importance of metrics. We're seeing an increased acknowledgement of how critical a data-driven approach is in planning energy projects and confirming energy savings and furthering energy and climate issues. From the National Green Button Energy Data Initiative that we're seeing in California to the Department of Energy's new LEAP program to support cities in energy analysis, to California state tracking initiatives and new legislation such as AB 802. So in this data-driven space, what metrics, well, I'm going to ask a few questions altogether. You can pick and choose. What metrics are driving your approach? What data sources are you leveraging? And how are you gathering these data? And if it's relevant, what data are missing?
Take a crack at it.
You're the guy with the software. So.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah. So definitely, I think we live in an era in which technology has become, a very powerful tool for us, and we're amassing larger and larger stores of data. The question is, how do we make sense of it? And how do we filter through it, interpret it to help inform our policy decisions and that sort of thing. So I mentioned the protocols and the software. I think there are some specific elements that we see over and over again that are really helpful. So with the ClearPath software, we have over 300 users in California now. I think, like I said, several hundred inventories, about 150 forecasts, and even cities that have built their climate action plans in here and estimated the emissions reductions they'll get from different policies. When you look at the inventories, I think it's not just a question of what are our total emissions? Are our total emissions growing or declining? But you can really get into some pretty granular detail, going sector by sector and identifying really what's working and what's not. So if you look at the protocol, there are basically 5 kind of required sources. Those are stationary electricity and stationary fuel combustion, on-road transportation, emissions from solid waste, and emissions from embodied energy in water and wastewater. And so, as we're tracking these things over time in quite a bit of detail, I can start to tease out, we're doing really well, in commercial energy, for example. We're seeing improvements in land, in waste emissions, and we can see that some of that's a result of landfill gas capture. So you really start to get a pretty fine-grained understanding, not just of emissions, but really of city performance as a whole, from waste to transportation to buildings to wastewater. I think we're really getting more sophisticated about the data. So as we looked at what to do through SEEK this year, historically ICLEI has focused on the tools, the training, the technical assistance. We're seeing research as more of an opportunity as ARB updated their scoping plan and said we really want to have more of a public source for sharing data that's coming from the local level. As OPR continues to do its research and distribute its planning surveys and that sort of thing, we're contributing to that effort and really well positioned now to contribute to that research for a couple of reasons, I think. So SEEK, it's a platform for cities to access statewide climate action. And it's really the only sort of statewide platform linking cities in. So we're in kind of a unique position in that way, to be looking at the data, doing the research. And now with the software tools, I think it's an even clearer fit. So I'm going to talk more about some of the findings from our State of Local Climate Action report, but maybe for now I'll leave it at that.
Data and information it's a fascinating subject. I do not have a degree in anything that involved counting anything. And so I have a degree in political science. So counting votes, I guess. So when I was in the legislature, if I could count to 41 on the Senate floor, or on the Assembly floor, or 21 on the Senate floor, then I was in good shape. But seriously, what's really important to understand, and what we try to deal with, is data and information is useful if it's helping you make choices. And so the kind of data you need and the kind of information you need to collect depends on the kind of decision you're trying to make. And so that can range from everything from what's the right technology to put in place to modernize your HVAC system, and you're going to collect certain kind of information about that and data and do some research around that, versus what's the best use of $400 million in cap and trade funds if you're a member of the state assembly. Different kinds of data, different kinds of information. They both have to be reliable and something that you can count on, has to be somewhat verifiable, you would hope, particularly at the $400 million level. But recognizing that everybody's going to have a different need for different kinds of data. And so you're asking the question, we rely on folks like the people in this room to know the more detailed sorts of information that you need. If you're with an IOU or you're with a local government and you need to be able to figure out how are we actually doing, or what are the choices that we need to make, or should we swap out streetlights, and how many does it make sense for us to buy our streetlight system or not? That kind of data analysis is going to be way beyond any kind of information that we would necessarily collect, but we're translators, and so what's important to us, and so I'll do a little thought experiment or set up for a next question maybe. I put on your table a couple copies of this one-page flyer. I just ask you to kind of take a look at it while we're talking here, sort of see what it is, and then look and see if your city or county is on here. And it'll be relevant later when we talk about why that is important. But in many cases, it's these the small questions, they're not really small, but the detailed questions are really important. But the big questions are really important as well. And from our standpoint, we think that's where the need is. How can state policymakers better understand in an absorbable, digestible way what's actually happening at the local level and what kind of results you're getting, and can it be standardized, and can it be reported and collected on a regular basis? That has huge implications for large-scale decisions that get made about where this whole effort, this whole initiative to address climate change are. And so we're focused on trying to improve that interface of data between the local and the state level, so that there's better understanding from the state level and there's better understanding from the local level of what's happening statewide and how what they're doing fits into the larger whole. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Well, thanks, Steve. So again, a few talking points already addressed. I sat down with my SGC colleagues earlier this week, and we were brainstorming about how to work together to improve the understanding of what emissions measures are working best and which ones are falling short, which ones are underfunded but could work well if strategically funded. And so I'm starting with the gaps, right? And so when we think about what might be really helpful from a data standpoint, it's what are we underfunding or undersupporting that if we just put a little nudge in, could really help really accelerate the work that's being done at the local level that responds to some of the state goals and priorities. And as Bryan mentioned, the See Clear Path tools, they really provide a wonderful opportunity for us to understand which of these policies are working, which ones aren't. Of course, they're in a model, so they're not real, so to speak, aside from the numbers that are actually coming in from the utilities and actual data numbers that are being represented. But when we look at these individual policies, understanding how they work over time is really the most important thing that we're looking at now. Just a couple of years ago, we were trying to figure out, what is working at all. And so that's a huge leap from trying to figure out, is anything actually working, to understanding which policies are working or not working that we need to strategically fund. We've been in an interesting discussion over the past few years at the state level, because all the state agencies collect, manage, and deploy information differently. There's no really uniform standard across the board in how we understand what the agencies are doing and how what they're doing with our local partners is affecting the statewide picture on emissions. This scoping plan update that's in process right now is really trying to answer some of the questions on the regional and local role in statewide reductions. We attempted to paint a little bit of a picture in the 2014 scoping plan, and Bryan and Steve were both engaged a bit in that discussion, as was Cal Poly and a number of others who have databases on actions, and we tried to roll up the work that's being done at the local level into a snapshot of what local governments were doing for that 2014 plan, and ultimately we really couldn't, because there wasn't enough standardization across the board. But what we're getting to now with the ClearPath suite of tools and this standardization across the board is we're going to be able to look at it, represent the local government role in statewide reductions, get that into the scoping plan, and ultimately provide better access to state funds for reducing emissions to our local partners if we know those policies that are going to be implemented will actually reduce emissions significantly. Because then we have proof of concept. We can point to them and say, listen, these policies are working. Let's develop a program, fund our local partners to make this happen so that we can faster achieve our statewide goals. And that's really a big objective in the next couple of years, is trying to get that picture. And a lot of people, when they say, oh, you want access to our monitoring database for our local government emissions, I don't know, that's a little big brother. And my argument is, no, give us that data. The more data we have that shows that you're making good progress on your reductions gives us the argument to the legislature that you should be funded to support that good work on the ground. There's been some recent movement to provide better data access, but data access isn't enough either. Bryan and I have been talking about ClearPath, and before that, CAPC, the Clean Air Climate Protection Software tool, which was sort of the first step in that. And how do we actually plug data into it in a more standardized, normalized route so that people aren't constantly having to collect the data and put it into this tool manually, that it can actually happen in a more automated fashion. And we're getting a little closer to that. We've recently released a lot of the state data that we have across the board, including some emissions and risk data from climate risk standpoint through the GeoPortal, which is basically a protocol that allows you to use that data in any web tool that's a web services tool, and you can access that data and manipulate it in your own kind of tool if you build it around the data. And we're using that data to inform the general plan guidelines update, which will be coming out later this summer. And there'll be a general plan guidelines tool that's connected to that, as well as connected to CalAdapt, the Adaptation Planning Guide, and the ClearPath, to really help create a more robust, holistic picture in accordance with the name of this conference, right? A more holistic picture of how local governments should be addressing climate change. And a lot of you are already sort of the leaders out front on this. Many of you struggle, I know, with going beyond energy, because the funding is here for energy action plans and for implementing those energy action plans, but rounding out that policy structure is challenging because the funding just isn't there. But we're trying to answer some of the questions and make it a lot easier to go through the rest of the process. So I'll leave it there, because I think the slides that we have to show in the next question are actually really highlight where we've come and where we can go next.
Great. I appreciate the point to the holistic approach, and I know that that's something that a lot of folks are interested in, and also your point to really getting a sense of what policies and programs are, where the implementation of policies and programs and the data that we're seeing on the actual emissions side, where those line up. As all of you know, I'm working on an initiative, part of the statewide coordinator's responsibilities are tracking a variety of programs across the state, and my predecessors have tracked programs like retro-commissioning policies implemented by local governments, and implementation of revolving funds. But I'm really broadening that effort so that we can try to have a broad picture of what are cities and counties doing in their community to promote energy efficiency. What are cities and counties and regional governments doing at the municipal level? Within those programs and also in other efforts, what ordinances are out there, what innovative projects are out there, so we can start building that. And we're going to see a couple of slides on what we're finding already, but so we can really build out that very comprehensive picture. So we keep talking about what we're going to see. I think we should jump in there. So this is the State of Local Climate Action in California. How are we doing? I know that this is an ongoing process, but what are each of you finding is the state of local climate action, and where are we going? And I'll, in the sake of time, I'll also just throw out there if you can speak to opportunities and barriers, opportunities that other local governments might not know are out there that they can jump onto, and also barriers that you're seeing that we maybe need to figure out a way to address together. I know that you all have some slides. Maybe we can start with Michael, and I need to
and you can
hand
you can just move that over if you want. You can just click it over. It's
yeah,
fine.
okay.
It's 2 slides. It's good.
All right.
Well, many of you know about the annual planning survey. It's a survey that we do every year, except for the past 3 years. Little comic release there. Sometimes with all of our other obligations, we struggle to actually do some of our minimum basic statutory mandates. But I'm a local government guy by nature. I'm a local government planner. I worked at the county level. I was a consultant for many years. I wrote a number of climate action plans. So I have a real interest in making sure that the annual planning survey is something that's responsive to local needs, knowing how much we used it, and particularly as a consultant, it was very helpful to know what people were doing and what people were out of date on, so that we could approach them. But in this role, thinking about the data on climate change, things have shifted quite a bit since 2008, 2009. And 2008 was really the first year we had much data.
Over here?
Oh, over here. Okay. 2007 was the first year we asked the question, what are people doing on climate change? The first question was, are you doing anything on climate? Yes or no, right? And so we got this response back. Around 25% of communities in 2007 were doing something on climate. Obviously, all of these bars have a different error bar. There's different response rates. But for the most part, and this is shocking for those of you in the social science background, but we get a 70 to 90% response rate on the survey. So for the most part, this is pretty accurate. So for the respondents, that's the last 5 bars are basically an error bar based on the respondents. In 2013, we actually had a pretty low response rate. And in 2016, because we hadn't had a survey since 2013, we did a public review of our 2013 findings and asked people to self-update the matrix. And many of you in this room responded to that, and I greatly appreciate it. I also had an intern work over the past couple of months to update the information and make a lot of phone calls. And we had some consulting firms that I know are doing work in a number of communities help us fill in the gaps a little bit. But what we came up with is things really haven't changed that much in the past couple of years about who's doing work on climate. And there's correlation, not necessarily causation, with the 2007 to 2009 numbers because of the emergence of the Strategic Growth Council, Energy Efficiency Conservation Block Grants, AB 32, the Attorney General's comment letters, which were probably one of the larger forcing mechanisms. And in 2009, we had a huge number of jurisdictions that had said they were working on climate change. So if we go to the next slide, the picture is based on, wow, that is really small. The pictures based on what we've looked at this past year is fascinating. So we went from that first question in 2007, the yes or no, are you doing climate stuff, to now asking a much more detailed question. And if you guys can go back to your jurisdictions or your partners at the local level and talk with them about making sure they respond to the annual planning survey that's currently open right now, that would be fantastic, because we're trying to really get a good response rate on this, and we have about 55% of jurisdictions reporting. We'd really like to get closer to 85 or 90 to get some good numbers on this. But we have these 3 categories of, adopted or completed, in progress, or planned. And when we look across the board, we have really significant differences in where people are talking about climate change. You know, greenhouse gas emissions inventories, obviously that's some of the stuff that people do first out. Our numbers show about 45% of jurisdictions in the state have an inventory that they call an inventory. You know, the other question about these surveys is there confusion about the question being asked? And OPR can be blamed for sometimes putting confusing questions out there. So the question of where you're actually analyzing emissions is a big one, and at greenhouse gas reduction plans, which is CEQA terminology, you know, we've got a fair number of jurisdictions, 27, 28%, having those already adopted, but there's also a number in progress. Climate action plans, which typically nowadays are also talking about adaptation, you know, we see a lot more of those currently in process, and that is a really good sign that that's something that continues to move forward. And the Newhall case, a recent court case that acknowledges the role in climate action plans and in being able to do greenhouse gas reduction planning community-wide, is a forcing mechanism as well to show the value of climate action plans. General plan policies is the next highest one down the line. And if you go all the way to the right, which doesn't have huge direct application to the folks in this room except for our coastal partners, the local coastal programs that also incorporate climate change. If you look at the dark shaded is in progress. And this is where data really gives us a good idea of what's happening on the ground. So before the Ocean Protection Council created a grant program to update local coastal programs to address climate change, there were only about 3 or 4% of jurisdictions on the coast with an LCP that had climate change addressed in their LCPs. After this grant program went into place, we now have about 30% of jurisdictions on the coast actually updating their LCPs to incorporate climate change. And this really shows the value of a really focused strategic funding program to address an issue. And it's also one of the reasons why SEEK is so important, because we wouldn't have such high numbers on the inventory climate action plan on down the line if SEEK didn't exist, because it provides an easy mechanism to update plans and programs, and obviously a standardized process to do that, training, et cetera. I'm excited to see the results of this annual planning survey. I have a funny feeling that these numbers are going to be a lot higher just because we haven't had a real survey since 2013. The other piece of this is the adaptation discussion. You know, and up until last year, we had a 2008 executive order that addresses adaptation, but nothing else. And last year, there were 3 bills and an executive order that all talk about climate change. And the big deal with Executive Order B 3015, which came out in early last year, was not that it was a big new executive order on climate. It's that it incorporated climate change emissions and climate change adaptation in the same executive order. That we're not talking about these things independently anymore. These are two sides of the same coin. When we talk about energy efficiency and urban heat island is an impact of climate change that we all need to be addressing. But when we talk about energy efficiency, you can't adequately address energy efficiency without also thinking about urban heat island as a significant impact and how you're going to mitigate that impact to address your goals around EE. So when we talk about climate change, I think one of the big changes that's going to be moving forward, and I think we're going to see this in our survey results, is people are talking about adaptation and emissions at the same time rather than fully bifurcating them. And one of the biggest challenges, and we've heard this from our local partners across the state, one of the biggest challenges to this is going to be having our emergency management officers talking with our planning departments. Right? How many planners in here have actually talked to their police chiefs and fire chiefs in thinking about their local hazard mitigation plan? Aside from the folks that have recently gone through the local hazard mitigation planning process, because obviously things are changing. But you know, these unique partnerships and these conversations that bring people to the table that really have never had a conversation before is really where we're going from now on out. And so I encourage you to reach across the aisle to the people you haven't been talking with, because climate risk is something this year and next, as we implement the legislation that was passed last year, is going to be a significant part of the climate discussion. And so folding that into how you deal with the emissions piece is also going to be important.
Great. Yeah, I can kind of build on some of that. So yeah, really interesting, sort of initial findings coming out of the planning survey update, and interesting to see activity sort of leveling off a little bit over the past few years. What we're finding in the State of Local Climate Action report, is consistent with that in some ways, but also showing a lot of progress being made, real progress being made over the past few years. So I mentioned that we're working on this report. It's a collaborative effort among all the SEEK partners, and we just have some initial findings today. These aren't final, and would love actually your feedback on some of these after the session if you have any thoughts as to other things we should be looking at. But just big picture, I think our findings are starting to paint a picture of statewide progress community by community at the local level. So we took inventory data out of ClearPath, 180 something inventories, whittled that down into those that had at least 2 years of inventories. Now this is the relatively recent development. We haven't really been able to say much about trends because we haven't had folks doing multiple years. Now there are a significant numbers. So we took out 44 cities and counties that had 2 years of inventories and found that almost 90% of them, 9 out of 10, were seeing emissions reductions in the period 2005 to 2010. So this is great news. Potentially there's a lot going on here. I have to make sure to put out the caveats. These are 2 data points. There may be external factors at play like the weather or the economy. But as we dig into the data, we can also see areas where you can see sector by sector the outcomes of different policies and programs. So it's great news, and it's great to see that we know that the state as a whole is moving towards its 2020 goal, and that downward trajectory is real, city by city, and measurable. And so that's a powerful finding, I think. Digging into that a bit more as to why that may be the case, I think one thing that's working really well is the action planning process out there. So whether it's energy action plans or climate action plans, we're seeing increasing numbers of jurisdictions adopting these. So you can see here, we found 212 completed action plans statewide, which is almost half of all local jurisdictions, with another 115 planned or in process. So this is really starting to become mainstream. We also found that the cities that are using SEEK resources are seemingly more likely to be completing their action plans, which is good to know. But plans don't. A plan sitting on a shelf doesn't reduce emissions itself, right? The things that actually cut carbon pollution are the implementation of the plans, the projects, the policies. And so we tried to dive a level deeper into some of the sectors and what's going on there. So taking again this total reduction across these 44 cities, this reduction was about equivalent to taking 268,000 cars off the road in just this 5-year period, and in just this sample size of about 10% of the state. We found that the reductions kind of broke out into these different sectors in different ways. So found that the commercial energy sector actually contributed a significant part of the reductions. And you can start to kind of evaluate why that might be. Of course, state policy plays a role there in terms of codes and other incentives. Again, there are external factors, so you have to start teasing it out. What's the role of the recession, for example? So there was still economic growth in 2006, 2007, but you get into 08 and 09 and really started to see the recession settle in. You would expect that to have a big effect on commercial activity, and the emissions associated with it. So that must play, some role there. But we looked at, what were the jurisdictions that were doing the most in terms of commercial energy. It turns out our host city here, the city of Riverside, of these 44, was the city that had reduced most in residential and commercial energy. Due to the good work of the city, the utility, WRCOG, the consultants that have been working in this region, you can actually see, the achievements that are being made here locally. We know that they implemented some, pretty significant commercial energy efficiency rebates. We know the municipal utility changed up some of its contracts to be getting to more renewable energy, I think double, or getting to 50%, or doubling the amount of renewable energy that they had in their portfolio. Real city policies are contributing to these reductions that we're starting to see. I could refer to another sector real quick, but maybe I should pause there.
Really quickly, that's very fortuitous of us. Great planning on our parts in the city of Riverside to hold the C conference here this year.
Round of applause for Riverside. I think that's actually a huge milestone.
I do want to keep comments brief. I do want to get to Steve. Maybe one more slide, a quick update from Steve, and then I do want to open up to the audience. We have clearly lots to say and not a lot of time to say it in. So let's do one more.
Yeah. Well, I guess real briefly, the other sector that we looked at here was solid waste. So when you look at the amount of emissions reductions within each sector, it was striking that the solid waste emissions in these 44 jurisdictions dropped by almost a third in just 5 years. And we started to tease that out a little bit. Again, there's this correlation with the economy, a demonstrated correlation between economic activity and waste. But we also found in a few jurisdictions that were leading on this, new landfill gas collection systems being installed, some of them funded by ARA funding in 2008, 2009, I think. And start to tie this back to state goals as well, right? So you're getting that high level direction and visioning from the state to get to 75% diversion, and around the same time started seeing these declines in local solid waste emissions. So I think it's another great example of what's going on at the local level.
Very exciting. Steve, I'll turn it over to you for a couple of minutes, and then we will have a short Q&A.
Okay, so I have a bar chart and a pie graph. So I guess I was in a sort of eat and drink mode at the time, but I want to sort of do this in the translation idea here, which is the information that's needed that was just talked about here is really information that is going to be absolutely critical for choosing which kinds of programs work and how they work, and what choices should be made about where to invest and where progress needs to be made more, and those sorts of things. Those are really, really important implementation kinds of questions. There's another set of questions that need to be addressed as well. So earlier, Joe Lyons got up and asked if there were any other elected officials in the room, and since the mayor of Riverside had left, the answer was no, which is you guys are doing a lot of the work, and the elected officials are not in this room. And we go to a lot of rooms where there's lots of the elected officials and not a lot of the people that are doing all the work. And so there's a real need for the translation in between and the level of information that's kind of needed. And so this kind of a graph here, which basically says, are cities and counties interested in voluntarily participating and doing rigorous things to actually address climate change, is like an obvious question for people that are doing it, not an obvious question for people in the legislature or for city and county mayors and supervisors. And so when you can show a trend that basically says, yes, there's a big uptake in folks that are being involved in this is just one among a many variety of ways you can do it, but this is the way that cities and counties, through their associations, are having folks do stuff. And so we can see there's a demonstrated move from innovators into mainstreaming ideas by the fact that so many communities are choosing to participate in what is a fairly rigorous program. Second question is it making any difference, and are these people making any progress? And I think the information that both Michael and Bryan shared shows that at a detailed level we can certainly answer that. But we can also answer it here, which is if you look at this handout I left on your table, these are the quantifiable reductions in energy, electricity, natural gas savings, community greenhouse gas reductions, and agency greenhouse gas reductions. And so these are quantifiable things that are through a standardized methodology where there's backup data for it, self-reported, but backup data verified with utility information, things of that sort. So we can definitely show that progress is being made. And it's also being made in terms of, what we were trying to do is have action become deeper, broader, and accelerate. And so if you just look from 2012 to 2015, most of the communities that were receiving recognition for the results that they were getting, in other words, the people that, the elected officials who stood on the stage at the League of California Cities to take credit for the work that you guys did in your communities, those guys, people, they were getting silver awards in 2012. By 2015, they were getting many more platinum awards. In other words, they had gotten, there were more of them, getting more rewards with deeper results. And that is a simple story trend to be able to say. More places are doing more things and getting greater results and reaching higher levels of achievement and moving through milestones at an accelerated pace. If you can say that in a minute to a legislator, they start going, oh, okay, I see what's going on here. And so the work that gets done here is absolutely essential for this kind of information to be able to be conveyed. And so my question to you is, if you see your city or county on this list, could you raise your hand? If you found yours, okay. Now, everybody else sitting at that table, you know you're doing at least as much as these people, right? But you're not getting recognition for it, and other people don't know about it. We're not rewarding you, we're not acknowledging you, we're not reporting that to the state. That's not coming into being results. So, join the program, do the planning survey, use ClearPath, provide information to Jordan, and this loop that is needed for the information to reach the policymakers will be much more complete. So that's my
and have your jurisdiction fill out the annual planning survey.
That's what I said, yeah, absolutely. Fill out the OPR survey.
Well, that's a great plug, and I know that we are starting to cut into our break time, but I do want to turn it out to the audience if there are any questions. This is a lot of interesting information. Yes, in the back.
Mitch Sears with the City of Davis. This morning, there was a group that was talking about some of the agencies. It occurred to me that community choice aggregation has not been mentioned in the room yet. And the reason why I bring it up is because it's a groundswell across the entire state. And the point I guess I would make is that CCEs are based on local decision making, and suddenly it empowers all the local decision makers. They have to become energy literate. And so you have a completely different sort of group of people talking to the state, talking to the legislature, talking to the agencies. Just wanted to get your feedback on what you see the role of CCAs going forward in energy efficiency and more broadly the energy question here in California.
Well, I mean, I'll take a crack at it, which you're probably all surprised at. But listen, CCAs are a reality. They are moving quickly, and I live in Davis. And knowing the work that Davis is doing on trying to track and monitor their own progress and really understand how emissions are being reduced or not and what the forcing mechanisms are, community choice aggregation allows the city to have really fantastic data. Listen, our objectives as a state is to, from a climate standpoint, is to see emissions reduced as quickly as possible towards our longer-term goals, do it in an easy way that is inexpensive, and institutionalize the consideration of climate change in pretty much everything that we do. And much of what local governments are doing are independent of our state policy. Sometimes they're reliant upon it in order to make the decisions. Other times they go in a different direction, but they still achieve the same results. There's a lot of different ways to achieve the same results. And sitting in obviously I can't speak on behalf of the administration on this, but speaking where I sit, anything that achieves emission reductions faster is a good thing. And regardless of how that happens, and if it benefits the communities that we're in and also provides better data at the same point, I'm a pretty happy guy because I'm a data wonk and I'm a planner. So I like these things to come together in programs that feed into the collective and more holistic objectives of the state, thinking longer term, smarter growth, better communities, and really addressing these big issues. So I think generally it's not necessarily a bad thing.
I'll jump in a little bit on that as well. I mean, in our earlier session on cap and trade, made the observation that we're entering a period of experimentation and innovation because we are actually trying to essentially reformulate for the 21st century our economy fundamentally. And it's something that's happened before. If you recall, Henry Ford invented the motor car before almost any roads in America were paved. And so public works departments were developed as a consequence of the invention of the motor car. And so local governments and regional agencies and the rest drive change, but also adapt to change. And so we're going to be experimenting, and we're going to see a lot of change in every sector. Energy is one that's hugely going to be leading in that. And so if you look again at this list, there are communities on here that are in CCAs. There are communities here. I live in Sacramento. I get my natural gas from a investor-owned utility, and I get my electricity from a municipal utility district. And each of them is doing things that are moving us in this direction. And so I think the role of local communities is going to just have a bigger and bigger and bigger role in all of this, and that whether that is how we're structured for energy, how we address transportation, how we address the whole range of issues that we're doing. The worldwide movement at Paris that led to those countries signing that, in many cases, came from the bottom up through cities and municipalities around the world banding together and pushing their national leaders. And I think we'll see that happening here as well, and it's going to happen in every sector of the economy. So I think we'll just be adjusting as we go along. It's going to be a really interesting time for my daughter to try to find her footing in a career.
I want to build on that a little bit real quick. I mean, the concept of experimentation and innovation, whether it's CCAs or other innovative policies and financing approaches, that sort of thing. It's central to what cities do, right? And that's why there's been so much leadership at the local level for the past, not just few years, but 10, 20 years, and also at the state level. So, when we titled the new report, The State of Local Climate Action, part of it is about, an assessment of what's going on. The other is a recognition that California is the state of local climate action. When you look around, as an international organization, we have a pretty good picture of what's going on in different countries, states in the United States. Hands down, cities are more active in California and more supported by state government in California than pretty much anywhere in the world. So you look at something like the Compact of Mayors campaign. This is a global campaign in which cities make a commitment to taking a series of actions over the next few years, reporting them publicly, and then all of that information gets scaled up into the UNFCCC process and reported at every COP every year. So the Compact of Mayors has become part of the international governance framework. California has more cities participating in the Compact of Mayors than any state in the world, any state or province. And it's just an example of the way that we're increasingly improving conditions in our communities, creating more resilient communities, and also actually having a meaningful impact on keeping the world under a 2-degree threshold. And so, Michael and I were at the Conference of Parties in Warsaw 3 years ago, talking about what subnationals are doing in terms of leadership. It was an uphill battle to even convince the member states of the UN that they should even be thinking about cities. Then last year, as the Paris Agreement was reached, we took Mayor Schaaf from Oakland, Mayor Casillas-Salas from Chula Vista, and others into Paris, and they were a centerpiece of the conversations. It was all about the action agenda and a very strong focus on what cities are doing, how they can be better supported, and of course Governor Brown was a huge presence there as well. So yeah, really appreciate that perspective and do think that it's an exciting time to be working with cities here. Yep.
And I'm gonna, sorry, Jordan, I know you're like chomping at the bit to get this closed out, but from the state standpoint, our role is to respond to leadership at the local level. If you look at what we're doing on greenhouse gas reductions, climate change, and land use, the vast majority of the work that we're doing there has come from feedback from the local governments that we need to make it easier to do certain things, that we need to get out of the way on certain things, to provide incentives to do certain things that are really providing progress and opportunities locally. And I think that the discussion on innovation is a huge one. You're the ones that understand what's working and not working on the ground. We at the state roll that up and take it and run with it from a policy standpoint. So the better data that we have that can inform the policy decisions that we're making at the state level around funding, programs, and technical capacity building support, et cetera, that's really what we're looking for. And so I applaud all of you, because the collaborative, the State Energy Efficiency Collaborative, is really a huge reason why we are making such good progress statewide on a consistent basis. And I wanted to make sure I said that before this panel ended, because it's the truth. And many of you may not hear that on a regular basis, but it is the fact in Sacramento that we look to your work to inform what we're going to be doing in the next couple of years.
Well, with that, I want to thank all of you in the audience, all of you local governments, for contributing to this data that was produced today, because I think these are some really interesting initial findings. And I want to thank all of our panelists. So let's give them a round of applause.